This is episode 224 of the VoiceBot podcast. Our topic today is voice assistants in the car. Commentary today comes live from Clubhouse with Brett Kinsella and Eric Schwartz from voicebot.ai. Hey there, VoiceBot Nation. This is Brett Kinsella, host of the VoiceBot podcast. Today we have an episode by popular demand. My colleague from voicebot.ai, Eric Schwartz, and I hosted a discussion last week in Clubhouse dedicated to discussing VoiceBot's latest datasets tracking consumer use of voice assistants in the car. We did schedule this at the last minute and had a lot of requests to share the recording, so we decided to publish it as a podcast. So that's what we have for you today. Voice assistants, as you know, are used across many devices and in many different contexts today. The car is what we would characterize as among the big three, along with smart speakers and smartphones. These are the surfaces that have the largest voice assistant user bases, both overall and in terms of active users. The recently published In-Car Voice Assistant Consumer Adoption Report for 2021 by voicebot.ai is a jumping off point for today's discussion. This report includes consumer adoption data from the US, UK, and Germany, and includes consumer trend data going back to 2019. There's also a lot of analysis dedicated to the capabilities and momentum of the key vendors that are providing voice assistant technology to the automakers. So everyone's going to know Cerence, Amazon with the Alexa Auto, Google with multiple automotive solutions, Apple with CarPlay, and many more. The report itself can be found at research.voicebot.ai. That's research.voicebot.ai. That report includes 32 charts, hundreds of data points, nearly 50 pages of analysis. It is the most comprehensive assessment of the voice assistant adoption by drivers published to date. Certainly the most comprehensive that we've done so far at voicebot.ai, but from what we've seen in the market, definitely the most comprehensive overall as well. We cover some of the highlights of that report and take questions from the audience. Eric Schwartz, he's the head writer at voicebot.ai. I'm sure many of you know him. He also discusses the trends in the news around automaker voice assistant related announcements. This will be a really quick way to get oriented around the state of voice assistant adoption and capabilities for the car. And for those of you looking for more information, just go to research.voicebot.ai so you can see the report there. Great. Next up, voice assistant adoption in the car in the US and Europe and key trends shaping the industry. Let's get started. Okay, folks, this is our normal Monday slot for the Conversational AI Innovators in the Conversational AI Club room. We haven't done this last couple weeks, actually for about 6 weeks because it's summer, but we haven't done it in a few days, or a few weeks, so I thought it would be good to slide one in. We will get back on the regular schedule, certainly in September. I'm Brett Kinsella, founder of voicebot.ai. I think most of the folks in here probably know that. And voicebot.ai is the leading publication around news associated with voice assistants and voice AI technologies. That includes chatbots, voice assistants, all the things that most of us are familiar with from a day-to-day basis. We also are known for data, and part of that is because we do a lot of reports. And so we have a report out today that Eric and I thought it might be just fun to jump on and talk about a little bit. And that's about voice assistant adoption in the car. That in-car voice assistant is what we would call one of the big three in terms of voice assistant use cases or device environments that people are using. And there's a few top line takeaways. I can tell people there's an article about it in voicebot.ai. You can go there and look at that sort of high level. You can go look at the report. There's both an executive summary, which you can download, as well as the full report. And the full report's like 50 pages, over 30 charts. So there's a lot of information in there. Plus we do an analysis of the key trends and some of the activities that are around the vendor side and the automaker selection of vendors in the space. And so there's a lot going on in it. And because it's one of the big three, we've got the smart speaker, the smartphone, and we have the car, it does influence a lot in terms of the trajectory of voice assistant adoption overall, because consumers are in their car a lot. At least they used to be in their car a lot. Some are more and more, and we've seen some of that in there already in the data. Now, over the past year, things have changed a little bit, but we expect that ultimately to get back to where we were maybe in 2019. And then we have the idea that a couple of different trends here. One is as people use voice in different environments, they tend to use voice more in other areas as well. We have someone in the room who has one of the folks who sort of first, I think, was able to tease this out, that there's some real data there where people are using smart speakers, for example, they're more likely to use it on the smartphone. And if they're using the smartphone, they're more likely to use it in the car. So that's one of the things, because the car actually influences. It's actually both the beneficiary of all these other voice touch points, but as people use in the car, they're more likely to use it elsewhere as well. And then there's this other main trend line around this idea of whether we're going to have a single assistant or multiple assistants throughout the day. And both of those arguments are still on the table. And the car is one of the areas where we have both specialists who are sort of looking at that multi-assistant world, and we have some of the generalists who are using that as yet another place where they can have a share of voice assistant throughout the day. Okay, so we're going to talk about news in just a minute, and we'll bring people up on stage. You guys, if you have questions, you want to make comments, raise your hand anytime. We'll get you up here pretty soon. I thought I would go through a couple of the top line findings initially for us to get started, so everybody's level set. Then we'll go to Eric. We'll talk a little bit about what we've seen in the news and how that's played out over the last year and how that might be influencing some of the data that we're seeing here. And then we're just going to have general conversation around trends, bring people up for comments, whatever you guys want to do. Okay, great. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is how big is this space? So our data shows in the US, there are 127 million consumers. So that's 127 out of about 260 million US adults who are using a voice assistant at some point while they're driving. Now, what does this mean? Let's talk about the definition there. This is the broadest definition of what a voice assistant use is in the car. And that means they could be using Bluetooth connected to the sound system. It could mean they're using their Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, which are projection technologies, which basically it's just the smartphone, but it takes over the screen, the infotainment center screen as well. So it's really that smartphone experience again, but it's a little richer than just using Bluetooth, connect to the phone. And then we have the embedded or in-car voice assistants provided by the auto manufacturers, embedded in the infotainment system. Sometimes they're custom, sometimes they're provided by one of the general purpose players like Amazon or Google. So this is the broad definition. So about 127 million in the US. Now, we have 3 years of data on this from the US around the car. We've been doing this report since 2019. This was the first year we actually added in the UK and Germany. And in future years, we hope to add in a few more as well. So in Germany, we have 27 million, so 100 million less, but also, it's 27 million out of an adult population of 69 million. And then in the UK, it's just under 19 million out of a 15 million total population. So you start to get a sense of how large these are. Now, the US, the adoption rate's more in terms of people who have tried it. However, if you go to the UK and Germany, what you're going to find is there's a higher proportion of users who are actual regular users. So we break this down into people who occasionally use it, people who are monthly active users, and people who are daily users. So those daily users being the power users, they're using it just about every time they get in the car. So what we see is we see a lot more of the casual users in the US. So a much bigger proportion of the users use it very occasionally, not on a monthly or daily basis. When you move into the UK and Germany, they tend to be more monthly active users at least, and a lot more daily active users. So in terms of the percentage of people who are using voice in the car, they tend to be more likely to be power users. So there's a couple things about that. First of all, the monthly active user rate in the US actually declined significantly between our January 2020 and our early 2021 study. And what we all know is in between that period of time, we had pandemic-related lockdowns. We had people shifting to work from home as opposed to the office, which all meant we had less driving overall. So we had not as much driving to work. Obviously, that was completely eliminated for many professions, not most, say many professions. And we also had fewer trips because nothing was open, so people weren't really going anywhere. And so we actually had a full 10 percentage point decline from about 64% to 54% of the people who were of voice monthly active users of all the people who are using voice in the car fell from about 64 to 54%. So that's really notable. Now, we'd seen a small decline in the previous year. That might have been within the margin of error. It seemed like it was slipping a little bit, and this was the year that we'd sort of validate that. But what we saw was an anomaly year where people were driving less. Okay, so clearly we have a big drop off in voice assistant use while driving in the US in terms of the regular usage. Now, we were about flat in terms of people who have ever used it. So in terms of occasional users, all those things combined, it's just a lot of those monthly active users from the previous year fell into that occasional use category. Why might this be? Our assessment is that because people were not commuting and because they weren't driving to unfamiliar places as much, they were just going around to places they knew, local trips to grocery store, other places they knew would be open, sort of the staples of everyday life, that reduced the frequency of time that they're going to be enacting the two most popular use cases for voice assistants in the car. And the first is navigation, and the second is making phone calls. So from a navigation standpoint, if you're only going around to places that you already know locally, there's no reason to use your voice assistant to get directions. You already know how to do that. And the second thing is these shorter trips means there's less time to make a phone call. So a lot of times the phone call is activated on a regular basis by consumers as they're on a commute or some sort of longer drive. And so that's really the point here is we think those probably had a significant effect. There could be other impacts as well. We hope to be able to learn that over the next several months in terms of additional data that we're collecting on this space. But that's the key thing that we wanted to point out. The other thing is we do have about 50% in the U.S. of the adult population that's using voice assistant in the car. So, and that goes up a little bit if you account just for people who have cars, but we're trying to get a total population number for adult users. So it's right around 50%. It's a 49% this year. And that's almost the same as it was the previous year. We had 50%, and then 2 years ago we had 45%. So it's come up a little bit over the last 2 years. It's fluctuated a little. We think that seems pretty stable. And in Germany, that's about just under 40%, and in the UK, it's 36%. Now, in each of those cases, in the US and in Germany, it's higher than smart speaker usage. And so this is one of the things I always point out. We talk a lot about smart speakers in the voice AI industry. Very important, new surface, new consumer device that's it's been introduced, and it's really changed consumer behavior in the home. Tom has a lot to say about this. He's in the audience today. He's done a lot of really interesting research in the home with users on this. So that's really important. However, it's really easy to overlook the car. Now, the car has has a broad set of use cases, but a narrow set of high frequency use cases than the smart speaker. So it tends to be used for these communications, entertainment, or navigation features. But still, it's a big surface area. And one of the things that we were looking at is that if you look at those occasional users in the US, it actually presents a pretty big opportunity potentially for voice app developers. And we say this because it is obviously a very large audience. We're talking about 127 million occasional, over 100 million people who are using these at least on a monthly basis. And they're only using 3 or 4, most of them, applications. And a lot of that is because most of the activity over the past year has been to bring existing smart speaker use cases, make them available to drivers. And that's okay. That makes sense because there are times when you might have, let's say, a smart speaker use case or maybe a smartphone use case that you want to use while you're driving. However, it also means that people aren't spending a lot of time really focused on the car. There are a couple, Drive Time. I think it's called Drive FM now. They rebranded, but for example, that was entertainment for the car and for the commute. So maybe a tough year last year because the commutes were down, but this idea that they built an application specifically for the driving use case. We see Blink Roadside Assistance, we see Urgently as well, have done these roadside assistant things, applications specifically for the car. And that strikes me as that's a pretty big opportunity for some people who might be thinking about, hey, what are some other use cases that we can do? Now, there's a lot of what I would say, there's a lot of competition for the primary use cases on the smart speaker. So it's a bit of a crowded market. For use cases that are really specific to drivers, it's not actually a crowded market. So those of you like blue ocean strategy might be something that you can consider. And in the US in particular, there's a lot of those casual users out there who just might be ready to be regular users if there was some reason for them beyond just navigation, getting their streaming music, or making a phone call. Okay, so those were a couple of key points that I wanted to make going into this. And so I've talked for quite a bit of time. I do have one other thing that I want to mention, and then I'm going to turn it over to Eric to talk a little bit about news. And the other is we've extended our model around what voice assistant use in the car looks like. So a couple of years ago in 2019, we really talked about this idea of the car and the driver. And so we said inside the car and then outside the car. And the big trend at that point was bringing all the digital services you have outside the car into the car experience. Because before what we had is you could use the navigation and the dashboard, or maybe there's some integration with Waze or Google Maps or something like that, which could allow you to do sort of the car function type of activity, cabin controls, entertainment. So those were the history. You know, voice has been in the car for 20 years. It started out with cabin controls, and it's expanded to these things that are very specific to the in-cabin experience. But 2 years ago, we started seeing the rush was for all these outside the car experiences: questions, search, smart home control, weather, social media connection, all those types of things. And we saw SoundHound with Houndify, we saw Amazon, we saw Google all trying to bring these things that were popular on other platforms into the car. And that leads to more personalization, right? So you have controlling the car, and then you have driver personalization through these other features. You put them together and you have kind of a holistic experience. Except the big trend over the last 2 years that we've seen coming up is this idea of the journey, on the road activities. And so I think that's the third major area now that we've added to our model when you look at this. Things like ordering takeout, fuel payment, roadside assistance, finding parking. Those are very specific to the driving experience, are used fairly regularly. Many of those are available through smartphone apps or through the smart speaker, but they're not specific to that context. You're much more likely to need them when you're actually in the car and out and about. And so that's the other thing I just want to bring up when we start thinking about how this space is evolving. We're starting to see applications come in that are really about the journey. And so that might be one of the ways that third-party developers are starting to play in this space. Okay, great. So that's some good setup. Hopefully gives you a little bit of context. We certainly could talk about more data or findings there, and we can take questions when people are ready to raise their hand. But before we do that, I want to turn it over to Eric, because one of the things Eric did as part of this is he looked at the major announcements over the last 12 to 18 months around voice assistants in the car, the news associated with that. And he had a few key findings around that. So Eric, why don't we start this process by talking about, in terms of the top stories in voice AI, what stood out to you?
Sure. Yeah. There is, as you said, it's been a busy time for voice AI in cars. I'd say, breaking it down, the main trends have been about what kind of features are in a car. I'd say it's what kind of features in the car, which company is powering those features, and also what the labeling, the branding is, because I think there's a lot of discussion within the automotive industry of how much they want to put their own label on voice AI in a car versus how much they want to rely on the branding power of an Amazon or a Google for their when they're trying to sell people on purchasing their particular vehicle.
Okay, well let's break that one down first, that third one. So there's branding. So we know about the wake words from the consumer, the popular consumer assistants, right? And those are starting to become available. You know, obviously they have been available for a while through the smartphone integration, but they're starting to become available in the dashboard. So there's that point. And then we have the custom OEM provided on brand names like Hey Mercedes or Hey BMW or those types of things. One of the things I thought was really fascinating over the last year is the integrations by a few auto brands that seem to be putting the big consumer tech company brand first. Like I'm thinking about the Fiat 500 Google edition. I'm thinking about the Buick. Maybe you could break that down a little bit and give your perspective on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a lot of trust, or a growing amount of trust, in the voice assistants created by the big brands. And so when a car company is trying to sell their vehicle based partly on how advanced it is technologically and how comfortable it is to use, they want people to think, using the voice AI in my car is just like using it with my Google Nest Hub or my Amazon Echo. So you see things like, as you said, the Fiat 500, which is heavily branded in terms of Google Assistant, with the branding on the outside of the actual car and the paint, and then in the ways that all the elements of the car are built around Google Assistant. And then meanwhile, you have things like Buick, which is relying on Alexa as its voice assistant in a way that's not too dissimilar from other vehicles. But in terms of branding, they created a TV commercial that consists entirely of people arguing whether the car is a Buick or an Alexa, thus putting the idea of Alexa as just as important to making a decision to buy a car as whether or not it's a Buick. So it's very interesting there. But at the same time, these companies are opening up more ways for car companies who don't want their name associated with Amazon or Google directly, so that they can have their custom Hey Mercedes or Hey BMW, whatever it is they want. So it's just a question of in the world of marketing, whether or not the voice assistant will be a selling point or something to discreetly discuss without bringing it up to the forefront of the actual consumer commercials and advertising.
I thought it was interesting with the Buick situation because they really subordinated their brand to Amazon Alexa. It was, and Fiat did it as well in a certain type of way, but it was like, it's the Fiat 500 Google edition, right? Or the Hey Google edition. Whereas Buick just went a little bit further. And I wonder if it relates to their perception about the strength of the brand. I think it's well understood that Buick's had trouble over the last 20 years. In fact, it was almost discontinued. They decided it was between Oldsmobile and Buick, between which product line they were going to discontinue. And they decided to stick with Buick. And it seemed like they were thinking that the Amazon brand was stronger than the Buick brand.
I think so. And I think it's also coming from from Amazon and Google in terms of the things that they can use, the things they can suggest or offer to car manufacturers as to why they choose them. I think the power of their brand is very much a part of it, because you have companies like SoundHound and Cerence who have often just as, if not more, capable voice assistant platforms, which are very much designed around being the brand of the car itself, not on its own. The average car customer knows who Amazon and Google are, but it's not necessarily going to have heard of SoundHound. They may have heard of SoundHound as a specific kind of app, but they definitely won't have heard of Cerence as being like a powerful voice AI. They're going to think of it in terms of, is it the Mercedes M-Bucks AI that happens to be powered by Cerence, things like that. So I think it's a marketing push from Amazon's side as well. I mean, that's why they created they're working on the next Jeep Wagoneer with the Fire TV specifically, not just any sort of smart TV, but Fire.
Right. So you brought up Mercedes, you brought up BMW. We're talking about two luxury car brands with among the strongest brand recognitions, brand equity capabilities in the space. And they have opted to provide some access to these other types of solutions, but they're really focused on their own brand. Hey, Mercedes, hey, BMW. And we saw over the last year significant advances in the feature sets for both iDrive from BMW and the MBUX Hey Mercedes system.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that sort of ties into some of the other things we're discussing about in terms of the capabilities of these brands. That's one of the reasons Amazon and Google want to sell the idea of their brand, is because it may not be that that their car AI can do everything that Cerence might be able to, but it can do all the things that Alexa and Google Assistant can do in your smart home, and also add in things for your car. So there's extra benefits there, but it's a question of how independent the car company wants their AI to be from the sort of the juggernauts of Google Cloud or AWS, and how much data they're willing to share, things like that.
Absolutely. Okay, so another trend you mentioned in your, I think it was your top 3, was the selection of different technology providers for in-car voice assistants. And we've seen a lot of dynamism there. And I think what we saw in the past was a lot more announcements of product, but we're seeing a lot more selections of product or potential changes in the portfolio mix of the technologies.
Oh yes, that's absolutely true. I mean, it's a mixture of the platforms themselves opening up and of what the car companies want to see in the car itself. So, for instance, continuing the trend of Google trying to make itself more of a universal voice assistant that happens to include cars. I mean, they recently, as part of their ongoing partnership with Samsung and Samsung SmartThings, they allowed Samsung to create a Android Auto version of the SmartThings app, so that now they can try to convince those who use SmartThings to buy a car that has or use Android Auto when they're in their car as well, because it can connect to their smart home devices. And meanwhile, you have companies like Ford, which has traditionally been very much trying to be as independent as possible from the larger tech companies, working with Cerence to make sure that the Ford Auto AI is its own entity. And then with the advent of a new CEO, has abruptly decided that it's no longer necessary, and it will go ahead and work with Google and Amazon in various capacities to integrate their technology into its capabilities, rather than having to continually reinvent the wheel essentially within their own laboratories. So there's some real shifts in that regard.
Yeah, and if I look at this, I think there's 3 things that really stand out to me in terms of product announcements or market momentum that I'm taking note of. One is we had Cerence come out with their Drive 2 platform, which significantly expanded what they're going to do. But I think probably the more important aspect wasn't just all the feature expansion, but the new architecture, which allows a lot more flexibility. And I saw this as really interesting, because we think about Nuance Automotive, which started 20 years ago, expanded significantly. I think it was 2003 when they bought the Philips in-car technology. And for many years were just sort of dominant. In many ways, they're still dominant. They're in almost 400 or maybe over 400 million vehicles on the road today. They're in every country, every auto brand. We even see them in one of our charts. It's like they're everywhere. And they didn't have any competition for a long time. And there was this move over the past couple of years with the projection technologies that came out. Okay, that was sort of eroding a little bit their mind share, control of the dashboard. But this push by Google and Amazon, I think, has just been another catalyst for them to step up their game. So I thought that was really interesting, where they've added new capabilities, they've added a new architecture, make it more flexible for auto manufacturers. I think the rise of the Google Android Automotive operating system which is really significant. That's not Android Auto. It's often confused. Android Auto is a projection technology. It's just your smartphone on your car screen, whereas Android Auto OS then controls the infotainment experience. And they've had a couple of really big wins announced over the last year. Now, that doesn't mean that Google Assistant is a sure thing. Google Assistant's actually not standard in that package. It's an upsell or an extra feature that you have to acquire from Google, but it certainly does position Google Assistant to be more effective. And so they had a couple of big wins, and including the Ford announcement, which I think was really important. I don't think that precludes Cerence or SoundHound from what I've understood, because they can still have custom connectors to any type of Android infotainment system. But the fact that Google has a little momentum here, I think is the significant takeaway. And then we saw Amazon come out with the custom assistant, which I think was completely driven, based on what I understand, by the need for automotive manufacturers to have custom wake words and saying, yeah, this is great. We can have Alexa sometimes, but if you want us to really integrate you, you've got to allow us to have a custom wake word and some control over the customization of that in-cabin experience. And the announcement in January with Fiat Chrysler and this idea that they're going to be that infotainment center OS for some automotive manufacturers, I think is significant. I think they're further behind, obviously, as the other two companies. Cerence is well embedded. Google seems to have a little bit more momentum around 2023 integration. But Amazon with a custom assistant is putting it in play for some of this competition going forward. They came out with the Lamborghini model, which is small base, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, and I would say that it's worth showing how Google and Amazon are attempting, I would say, more in the automotive space maybe than anywhere else, to be flexible when it comes to working with other brands or being willing to combine their software with other hardware, simply because they have to, of course, with cars. But you mentioned the custom assistant. I mean, Fiat Chrysler was a major win for them, but the fact that they're also working with Garmin, who generally make independent devices that you plug into your vehicle or that are used for commercial trucks and things like that. They're really willing to stretch in that regard. And meanwhile, Google, you mentioned things that Cerence can do, and Google and Cerence work together so that Cerence can actually operate within the Android automotive operating system, which means that they are making it easier for the car manufacturers who don't have to pick one or the other. They can pick they can pick Android automotive and still have access to the things that they might like about Cerence, because Cerence recognizes that there are manufacturers that will pick Google over them, and they can still have an in for that market without having to cede it entirely to Google.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start bringing people up on stage. I just invited someone who had their hand up. So just a quick room reset here. This is a last minute thing that we threw together today because we put out a new report on voice assistants in the car. And we wanted to talk about this topic because it's one of the more important topics that we've had over the last 5 years in the voice assistant space. And it's been evolving. And in fact, over the last year, there's been some significant change. I'm Brett Kinsella. I am the founder of voicebot.ai. You guys can get your news there around voice assistant data. But we have new report out. And you can go find this at research.voicebot.ai around voice assistants in the car, 50 pages of analysis, 32 charts, and then just a lot of additional context around the space, plus multiple years of data. So that's the impetus for why we're here today and just having this conversation. So first I want to invite Jim to make a comment, ask a question. Join us, Jim.
So my question is more on your perspective on the aftermarket space, meaning that, the head units are relatively inexpensive, and they just give such a better experience than auto manufacturers' systems. And I'm only familiar with up to about 2015, 16. The experience is so much better if you have your own head unit in with either, I'm a little bit more familiar with Android Auto, but even CarPlay from Apple's a way step up from what the auto manufacturers were offering. Have any kind of perspective on that from more like the aftermarket space?
Well, Are you talking about the aftermarket space in that the OEM had an infotainment system that didn't support CarPlay? Someone replaced their infotainment system so they could have CarPlay access?
Either that or they had nothing.
Okay, got it. Well, I think there's a couple things to think about there. So when we talk about the aftermarket space, I actually have no idea what percentage of drivers actually replace their infotainment system. And if you have that, I'd be happy to add that to this discussion. Do you?
I do not. I've done it myself, but I have no idea.
Okay. So I don't think it's common, but it may not be uncommon as well. There have been some opportunities for that. I mean, one of the places where I know this was happening was with Toyota. Toyota for some time has had, head units, infotainment centers that, it's a little bit behind, I think, the state of the art of the other large auto manufacturers. And so if you had a model which was before, I think 15 or 16, any of them, you could not get Apple CarPlay. So there was a movement over the last few years for some of those cars before that to put a new head unit in. And it was about $1,100 to $1,200. I think that did not include installation. So you might be $1,500 to $2,000 to get it installed just to get CarPlay for Toyota. I don't know. What did you pay?
I paid like $250 for the unit, and the installation was unbelievably simple.
Okay. Well, maybe most of that goes to the aftermarket or the auto shop that's putting it in. But I've seen some numbers around that because I remember looking at that when I saw that trend come up. In any event, I will say that there are the projection technologies, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, which basically take this smartphone experience and put it on the display. And those have been killers, right? So in terms of the most likely or the most used connection method for drivers, it's Bluetooth just from their phone. So it's just an audio only experience running through their sound system. In many situations, CarPlay is next, and then the embedded system in terms of the most frequently used. Because think about it, even if those people do use the provided voice assistant, and a lot of the cars up until a couple of years ago didn't have that, it was really optimized for things like maybe navigation, but you certainly didn't get Google Maps or Waze if you wanted to use those. And it also was around in-cabin controls. So there were people who were using it for in-cabin controls, but mostly they were saying, hey, you know what, the smartphone experience is really what I want, right? And if we're just talking about navigation, we're talking about using the phone, and we're talking about entertainment, that's all on my phone anyway. However, there's been a significant change recently. And that is not only have the features and capabilities of the embedded voice assistants improved, but they've also started to provide access to those really popular apps that are on mobile phones. So it's a little better. And now they're implementing these richer experiences. Now, we're only seeing this at the luxury end right now, but you can see this. Obviously, there's a little bit of Tesla envy going on here. But you see these larger displays. BMW and in particular Mercedes came out with a 56-inch wide display this year for one of its models. And my assessment is that the expanded screen real estate is going to be the best defense that the OEMs have against this cannibalization by the projection technologies. And it's going to be the most likely to drive this more consumer-centric, on-the-road experience from the automakers to the extent that they're providing those capabilities. The reason is because if you have a projection technology, you're only going to get this little screen, right? So if it's your 5-inch screen, even your 9-inch screen or something like that, all it's really going to do is rearrange the icons that are part of Android Auto or Apple CarPlay on your smartphone. And that's great. That's a good experience for most folks. But what the automakers are doing is they're now just providing much richer experiences with these beautiful screens that they're putting in. And to me, it's going to lead consumers to start choosing the projection technologies less often and the embedded system more often, because they're just going to have this richer, customized experience for the car. And then the key thing that the auto manufacturers are doing is they're also bringing in that personalization that comes from the apps that consumers use. They're providing that. And so that's my perspective on this. I think it's going to take 5 years to play out. We're going to still see CarPlay and Android Auto being very strong over the next 3 years. But I do expect some of the moves that we're seeing out there today are going to start to flip that within the 24 to 25 model year era.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, VoiceBot Nation, those of you who listened to the end even came away with a little prediction you can hold me to in the coming years. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Head over to research.voicebot.ai to see all the data about in-car voice assistant adoption in the US, UK, and Germany. If you have any questions about this topic or others, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. You can find me at Brett Kinsella. I think most folks know that. Even better, join the VoiceBot community on Discord. You can DM me there, as well as join in our discussion threads on the car and other topics important to the voice AI industry. It is the easiest way to get in touch with me and Eric and other people on the VoiceBot.ai team. We get overwhelmed by email. Twitter can be sort of something we use periodically throughout the day, but we're in the VoiceBot Discord throughout the day. So it's a really easy way to connect with us and your colleagues in the industry. There's 500 plus people in there. We're having discussions. People are sharing their latest activities because you can do that in that Discord group. You can post your latest blog, your latest podcast, start a discussion around healthcare that we just started a healthcare channel in there by popular demand. So check that out. VoiceBot Community Discord. You can join